There are moments when silence speaks louder than any headline, when the absence of denial becomes its own confession. For decades, George Clooney mastered the art of control. Control over his image, his career, his private life. He was the man who made distance look elegant, who turned independence into a kind of legend. The cameras loved him for it. The public admired him for it. And he believed, perhaps more than anyone, that distance was safety. So when the whispers began not with scandal, but with stillness, they unsettled people in a way gossip never could. There were no explosive accusations, no courtroom drama, no public betrayal. Instead, there was a pause, a hesitation, a few carefully chosen words that did not deny anything, yet did not explain it either. In that pause, something fragile revealed itself. Clooney had built his life on the idea that he could choose when to open a door and when to close it. Marriage, for years, belonged firmly in the second category. His early experience with it left scars that he hid behind humor and charm, turning skepticism into a punchline. He told the world he was bad at marriage, that it was not for him, that solitude suited him better. And the world believed him because he made belief easy. He filled the space with work, with laughter, with packed schedules and late nights that left little room for reflection. Yet even then, those closest to him noticed something quieter beneath the bravado. After the parties ended and the guests disappeared, the house grew large and still. Fame filled rooms, but not evenings. Success filled calendars, but not silences. It was a loneliness so subtle that it rarely made headlines, yet it lingered. Everything changed when Amal Clooney entered his life. She arrived without spectacle, without Hollywood ambition, carrying instead the weight of intellect and purpose. She did not orbit his fame. She stood firmly in her own gravity. Clooney later admitted that meeting her felt like something shifting beneath his feet, a loss of balance he had not experienced in decades. For the first time in years, he was not performing a role. He was waiting. Their courtship unfolded differently from any of his past relationships. There was patience where there had once been ease, sincerity where charm alone had once sufficed. When he proposed, the moment was awkward, even painful in its suspense, marked by silence rather than certainty. That silence ended in laughter and relief, but it foreshadowed something deeper. Silence, in their story, would never be empty. It would always carry weight. The wedding that followed, the children, the shared public purpose, all seemed to confirm that Clooney had found what he once insisted he did not need. He transformed visibly. The late nights softened into family routines. The restless movement gave way to roots. To many, it looked like a fairy tale corrected, a man redeemed by love. And perhaps, for a time, it truly was. But fairy tales rarely account for time. They do not measure distance in years or ambition in opposing directions. As their lives grew fuller, they also grew more complex. Two people driven by excellence do not slow down at the same pace, and they do not always want the same stillness. What once felt like balance began to feel like negotiation. What once felt like harmony began to feel like careful avoidance. The most unsettling aspect of the recent rumors is not what they claim, but how they are framed. Not as a collapse, but as a fade. Not as a fight, but as a quiet drift. Clooney himself hinted at this when he spoke about sitting across from someone you love and feeling miles away. He did not speak of anger. He spoke of grief, of realizing that something precious had thinned without anyone noticing the exact moment it began. In a world trained to expect drama, that kind of confession is almost disorienting. There is no villain to point to, no single mistake to dissect. There is only time, ambition, and the slow erosion that happens when lives run parallel instead of together. For a man who spent his life believing that control could prevent pain, this realization cuts deeply, because it suggests that some losses are not the result of failure, but of inevitability. The cameras still capture smiles. The appearances still look composed. Yet behind them lingers a question that refuses to settle. Can love endure when silence replaces conversation, when distance replaces conflict, when two people remain devoted, yet no longer aligned in the same rhythm of life. Clooney's silence does not answer that question. It leaves it open, heavy, and unresolved. And perhaps that is the most shocking confession of all. Not that something broke, but that even the most carefully constructed life can change quietly, without warning, until one day you realize that holding on requires more than love. It requires speaking before silence becomes the loudest voice in the room. For most of his adult life, George Clooney learned how to turn movement into a shield. When one project ended, another began. When a city grew too familiar, he changed countries. Film sets replaced permanence, and humor replaced vulnerability. It was not restlessness for its own sake, but a carefully maintained distance from anything that might demand emotional stillness. The world saw freedom. Those closest to him sensed avoidance. His skepticism toward marriage did not emerge from cynicism alone. It was shaped quietly by an early lesson that intimacy could feel like confinement when expectations outpaced understanding. Rather than dramatize that lesson, Clooney deflected it. He joked about being bad at marriage. He framed commitment as something other people manage better. Over time, the joke hardened into identity. He became the man who did not need anyone, and he played that role so convincingly that even he began to believe it. Yet success has a way of amplifying what it tries to hide. As his fame grew, so did the silence at the end of each day. Friends noticed patterns that never made interviews. The way he lingered after gatherings ended. The way he filled houses with people and then felt the absence more sharply once they left. Even his humor, sharp and effortless in public, softened in private moments. It was not sadness in the obvious sense. It was a quiet, persistent absence, like a room that echoed even when furnished. That absence made him unusually vulnerable to something he did not anticipate. When Amal Clooney entered his life, she did not fill the silence with noise. She challenged it by existing entirely outside the framework he controlled. Her days were structured by purpose rather than applause, by arguments made in courtrooms rather than on talk shows. She was not impressed by celebrity because it was irrelevant to her work. That indifference unsettled him in a way no criticism ever had. Their early interactions were marked by a reversal of power Clooney was unaccustomed to. He waited for her availability. He adapted to her schedule. He listened more than he spoke. For a man who had spent decades shaping narratives, this shift was both frightening and intoxicating. It required patience, humility, and a kind of emotional exposure he had long avoided. What looked effortless from the outside demanded real effort behind closed doors. Marriage did not arrive as a cure, but as a transformation. Clooney did not abandon his career or his principles, yet his priorities visibly realigned. Nights once devoted to excess softened into domestic rhythms. His presence became more deliberate. He spoke of routine with an unfamiliar reverence. Fatherhood, when arrived, deepened that shift. The chaos of twins disrupted his controlled world, but also anchored him. Noise replaced echo. Responsibility replaced drift. From the outside, the transformation appeared complete. The once untouchable bachelor now spoke openly about joy found in ordinary moments. The world applauded the narrative because it felt reassuring. If even he could change, then permanence was still possible. Yet beneath that reassurance lived a more complex reality. Transformation is not static. It requires constant renewal, and it exacts a price when two lives evolve at different speeds. As the years passed, the difference in their professional trajectories became more pronounced. Amal's work intensified, not because she sought distance, but because her field demanded relentless focus. Global cases do not pause for personal milestones. Academic commitments do not bend easily around family convenience. Meanwhile, Clooney entered a phase of reflection. Having achieved nearly everything his profession could offer, he began searching for meaning beyond repetition. This search did not make him idle. It made him restless in a new way. What once felt complementary began to feel asymmetrical. one life accelerating toward new summits, the other slowing, turning inward, craving stillness. This was not conflict in the traditional sense. There were no arguments that could be quoted, no dramatic ultimatums. Instead, there were logistical conversations that replaced emotional ones. Schedules discussed where feelings once lived. Practicality filling spaces once occupied by intimacy. The most dangerous shift was subtle. Silence, once comfortable, began to feel loaded. Conversations shortened not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it felt risky. Admitting fatigue felt like burdening the other. Admitting doubt felt like destabilizing a carefully maintained balance. So they smiled, coordinated, supported each other publicly, and postponed the harder conversations indefinitely. For Clooney, this pattern reawakened an old fear. The fear that control was slipping. Not dramatically, but gradually. He had believed that avoiding conflict preserved harmony. Instead, it may have preserved distance. In trying to protect the relationship from strain, he may have deprived it of honesty. That realization carries a unique weight for someone who spent his life mastering performance, because it suggests that sincerity, not charm, was the skill he needed most when it mattered. The past, once something he joked about, began to feel closer, not in behavior alone, but in mindset. Moments of solitude that once felt peaceful now felt isolating. Habits he believed he had outgrown resurfaced quietly, less as rebellion and more as coping. These were not scandals waiting to be exposed. They were signals of exhaustion, of a man confronting the limits of reinvention. What makes this chapter of the story so unsettling is its ordinariness. Strip away the fame, the estates, the headlines, and what remains is painfully familiar. Two accomplished people, deeply respectful of each other, struggling to align lives that have grown complex in different ways. No villain, no vitral, just time exerting its quiet pressure. And perhaps that is the true context behind the silence that now surrounds them. Not secrecy, but uncertainty. Not denial, but recognition that some questions cannot be answered cleanly. Clooney's past taught him how to avoid pain. His present is forcing him to learn how to sit with it. The tragedy, if there is one, lies not in the possibility of loss, but in the realization that love alone does not guarantee synchronization. It requires timing, communication, and the courage to disrupt silence before it hardens into distance. Whether that courage arrives in time remains unclear. By the time the rumors grew louder, the damage was already quiet. That is what made it so difficult to recognize, even for those living inside it. George Clooney had always believed that crises announced themselves with noise. Raised voices, public embarrassment, clear moments of rupture. What he was facing instead felt almost unreal, as if the marriage were dissolving without ever formally breaking, thinning day by day until even he struggled to name what was wrong. The period described as a turning point did not begin with a fight, but with distance that slowly became routine. Travel was nothing new in their lives, yet this separation felt different. It was not measured in days, but in continents, time zones, and incompatible rhythms. While Amal Clooney settled into a highly structured academic and legal schedule in England, Clooney found himself immersed in a world that demanded emotional exposure night after night. Broadway rehearsals were unforgiving. Performances were intense. Applause faded quickly, leaving behind long, silent walks back to an empty apartment. At first, the separation was framed as temporary, even practical. Two accomplished professionals honoring each other's commitments. They spoke with admiration in public, reinforcing the image of mutual respect. But admiration, over time, began to replace intimacy. Their conversations shifted toward coordination rather than connection. Calls became shorter, more efficient. Messages focused on logistics. The emotional space where vulnerability once lived grew narrower. Those close to Clooney noticed the change before he did. His energy dulled. The sharp humor that once flowed effortlessly became more restrained, almost defensive. After rehearsals, he lingered longer than usual, reluctant to return to rooms that felt too quiet. For someone who had once celebrated solitude, this discomfort was new and unsettling. It signaled that independence no longer felt like freedom. The night that later became symbolic was not dramatic in itself. It was on the surface a celebration. An awards event, bright lights, familiar faces, the kind of environment Clooney had navigated with ease for decades. But something inside him shifted. Years of discipline, of carefully managed restraint, collapsed into a moment of indulgence. What followed was not scandalous by public standards, yet privately, it carried immense weight. It was not about alcohol. It was about what the lapse represented. To Clooney, it felt like regression. To Amal, according to those who later spoke quietly, it felt like a breach of trust in the version of him she believed in. She had not fallen in love with the reckless bachelor. She had fallen in love with the man who had chosen responsibility, who had reshaped his life with intention. Seeing old patterns reappear, even briefly, threatened the foundation she relied on. The aftermath was marked not by argument, but by silence. That silence stretched over days, then weeks. Clooney attempted to minimize the incident, framing it as harmless. Amal did not respond with outrage. Instead, she drew a boundary. Calm, firm, unyielding. In doing so, she forced Clooney to confront something far more frightening than anger, disappointment. For a man who had spent his life earning admiration, the quiet withdrawal of it cut deeply. They retreated to their estate in southern France, a place once associated with restoration. The landscape was serene. The routines were familiar. Yet the calm only amplified what had gone unsaid. Mornings unfolded separately. Afternoons were spent working in parallel spaces. Evenings were polite, restrained, carefully neutral. Conversations avoided depth, skimming safely over shared responsibilities while bypassing shared emotion. This phase exposed a fundamental difference that had long been masked by chemistry and public purpose. Amal's world valued order, discipline, and long-term vision. Clooney's world, particularly at this stage of life, was grappling with impermanence. He was confronting aging, relevance, and the limits of reinvention. While she surged forward, he began looking back, not with regret, but with a yearning for stillness and reassurance. When the rumors of a trial separation surfaced, neither of them addressed them directly. The absence of denial unsettled observers more than any confirmation would have. Silence, once again, became the message. Friends described two people neither fighting nor reconciling, suspended in a state of unresolved distance. Clooney perceived the time apart as exile, a forced separation from the life that grounded him. Amal viewed it as reflection, perhaps even necessity, a pause to assess what could realistically endure. Public appearances resumed briefly, choreographed with precision. Smiles returned, hands clasped. The illusion of unity reassured the world. But those who watched closely sensed the strain beneath the performance. The gestures felt deliberate rather than spontaneous. Familiar ease had been replaced by professionalism. Two people capable of excellence, now applying it to survival. Behind closed doors, Clooney struggled with a realization he had long avoided. Control, the skill that had served him so well, was insufficient here. No amount of charm could restore alignment. No carefully worded interview could bridge emotional distance. He began to articulate this truth quietly, admitting to feeling disconnected even in moments of proximity. The word he used was not anger. It was grief. Grief for what had been. Grief for what he feared might not return. Grief for the version of himself who believed love could be stabilized through intention alone. This grief was compounded by the awareness that there was no clear fault to correct, nothing to apologize for in the traditional sense. Only a gradual drift that required acknowledgement rather than defense. Amal's rare public comments during this period carried a dual weight. They affirmed partnership, support, and shared history. Yet they also sounded reflective, almost archival, as if documenting something fragile rather than inhabiting it fully. Gratitude replaced warmth. Respect replaced closeness. For Clooney, these words were both comforting and painful. They confirmed that care remained, while underscoring how much effort it now required. What unfolded during this chapter was not a collapse, but an exposure. The exposure of a marriage facing the realities of time, ambition, and asymmetry. The exposure of a man confronting the limits of reinvention. The exposure of silence as something that can preserve dignity while quietly eroding connection. Whether this phase represents an ending or a reckoning remains uncertain. What is clear is that the narrative shifted irrevocably. The story was no longer about transformation, but endurance. No longer about discovery, but maintenance. And for Clooney, the hardest lesson emerged slowly and without spectacle. Love does not always fail loudly. Sometimes it fades quietly, demanding courage not to escape, but to speak. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a long reckoning with consequences that arrived quietly and stayed. The distance that had once seemed temporary began to leave marks on everything around George Clooney, from the way he carried himself to the way he spoke when no one was listening closely. Consequences did not announce themselves as punishment. They revealed themselves as fatigue, as hesitation, as a persistent sense that something essential required more effort than it used to. The first impact was internal. Clooney had always trusted his instincts, his timing, his ability to read rooms and situations. That confidence wavered. He found himself second-guessing decisions that once felt automatic. Even his work, the place he had always gone for clarity, became emotionally heavier. Performances demanded vulnerability at a time when he felt least equipped to access it honestly. Applause still came, but it no longer replenished him. It evaporated too quickly, leaving behind the same silence he was trying to outrun. That silence followed him into private spaces. Homes that once felt grounding began to feel transitional. Rooms carried memories rather than momentum. He noticed small absences more acutely than before. The lack of familiar sounds. The absence of shared routines. These were not grand losses, but their accumulation was exhausting. Consequence, in this sense, was not loss of status or wealth, but the erosion of ease. Socially, the shift was subtle but noticeable. Friends who once spoke casually about the couple began choosing words more carefully. Invitations became more tentative. Conversations circled around work and children, avoiding deeper questions. No one wanted to be the one who acknowledged what was unfolding. The absence of clarity created its own tension. Uncertainty became a shared but unspoken presence in every interaction. For Amal Clooney, the consequences manifested differently. Her life did not slow. It intensified. Responsibility, structure, and purpose continued to define her days. Yet even in that forward motion, there was a cost. Balancing professional excellence with emotional strain demanded constant discipline. She carried the weight of decision-making quietly, aware that any choice she made would be interpreted publicly, dissected for meaning beyond its reality. The children became both anchor and pressure point. They provided connection, continuity, and undeniable reason to keep moving forward together in some form. At the same time, they sharpened every question about stability. Every logistical choice carried emotional implications. Where to live? How often to travel? What consistency truly meant? These decisions were no longer abstract. They shaped daily life. Public perception added another layer of consequence. The world that once celebrated their story now scrutinized its pauses. Silence was interpreted as strategy. Appearances were read as statements. The inability to simply exist privately became its own strain. Each moment of restraint, each carefully neutral comment, reinforced the sense that the relationship had become something to manage rather than inhabit. Clooney felt this acutely. He had always understood fame, but now it felt intrusive in a new way. He could no longer frame his private life as irrelevant to the public narrative. Every absence was noted, every shift in tone analyzed. The freedom he once enjoyed as a bachelor had vanished, replaced by a constant awareness that even grief was subject to interpretation. Emotionally, the greatest consequence was the confrontation with aging. Not merely physical aging, but the realization that reinvention has limits. He had transformed once, dramatically, for love. Now he faced the possibility that transformation alone could not resolve what time and divergence had created. This awareness brought humility, but also fear. Fear that effort might not be enough. Fear that wanting something deeply does not guarantee its preservation. The relationship itself entered a new phase defined less by passion and more by negotiation. Respect remained intact. Care persisted, yet spontaneity diminished. Moments that once felt natural now required intention. Even kindness carried weight, as if both were conscious of preserving something fragile rather than living freely within it. For those observing quietly, the tragedy was not in the potential ending, but in the ongoing cost of suspension. Living without resolution demands endurance. It stretches emotional resources thin. It replaces certainty with vigilance. Over time, that vigilance becomes exhausting. The consequences extended outward as well. The foundation they built together continued its work, its mission unchanged, yet even that shared purpose now highlighted contrast. Joint appearances carried symbolism that once felt organic, but now required careful alignment. They remained united in values, even as their personal alignment wavered. What this phase revealed most clearly was the price of silence. Silence protected dignity. It prevented escalation. It avoided public damage, but it also delayed healing. Without articulation, pain lingered without shape. Without confrontation, distance solidified. Clooney began to understand that his greatest fear was not loss itself, but ambiguity. Not knowing whether what he was holding on to could still grow. Not knowing whether patience was an act of love or avoidance. This uncertainty colored everything. It followed him into rehearsals, into conversations, into moments meant to be restful. Yet within consequence, there was also clarity. The clarity that relationships do not fail solely through betrayal or neglect, but through gradual misalignment left unaddressed. The clarity that silence, while protective, can become corrosive when it replaces truth. And the clarity that even the most admired partnerships are subject to the same pressures as any other, magnified rather than exempted by success. This chapter did not deliver resolution. It delivered weight. The weight of understanding that something essential had changed and that restoring it, if possible at all, would require more than time. It would require risk. The risk of speaking into silence and accepting whatever response followed. That realization marked the true consequence of the crisis. Not public speculation, not rumor, but the irreversible awareness that love, once challenged by time and distance, demands courage not just to endure, but to confront what has been lost along the way. There are moments in life that exist almost entirely out of public view, when the world's eyes are elsewhere, and yet the weight of reality is most tangible. For George Clooney and Amal Clooney, these were the stretches of quiet that defined their story more than any red carpet or headline. Within the sprawling estates, across the continents that separated them, there were countless small decisions, small gestures, and small absences that carried enormous meaning. These were the moments no camera could capture, the moments that slowly revealed the strain beneath perfection. Friends and associates described them as being caught between devotion and distance. While public appearances remained polished and coordinated, private routines were fractured. Clooney spent long hours walking through olive groves, rehearsing lines for his Broadway debut, reflecting on how time had shifted the contours of his life. Amal, meanwhile, immersed herself in complex legal cases, lectures, and mentorship at Oxford, fully committed to her work and her students. Both were pursuing purpose, but at a pace and intensity that left their shared personal space feeling parallel rather than intertwined. Small things began to carry amplified weight. A delayed phone call, a missed video chat, a fleeting misunderstanding that would have once been inconsequential now required conscious attention. There were no dramatic arguments, only the accumulation of tiny gaps that widened silently. And for Clooney, who had always valued control and mastery over his environment, this slow erosion was particularly unsettling. He realized that love could not simply be managed. It had to be nurtured, spoken for, and reconciled constantly, especially when life demanded attention in different directions. Even ordinary moments, like dinner or bedtime routines, became tests of endurance. Conversations were polite, but often perfunctory. They spoke of schedules, children, and shared commitments, but rarely of themselves. Friends observed that these exchanges were cordial yet hollow, indicative of respect, but lacking the warmth that had once flowed naturally. There was a new carefulness in every word, a conscious effort to preserve civility while masking anxiety. Silence filled the gaps, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Yet not all was bleak. These private challenges illuminated aspects of their relationship that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Clooney's devotion as a father emerged more strongly than ever. Despite distance, he prioritized his children's well-being, embracing his role with deliberate care. He reflected on his own past, acknowledging mistakes and vulnerabilities that had been easier to overlook when independence ruled his life. Amal's unwavering dedication to justice and mentorship highlighted her resilience, her capacity to maintain purpose even amid personal strain. Their respect for each other's talents and commitments remained intact, and in some ways, it became the scaffolding that kept their relationship from collapsing entirely. The paradox of this period was striking. Love existed deeply even amid distance. Care persisted, visibly and tangibly. Yet the emotional thread, the subtle intimacy, the spontaneous connection, the effortless alignment was fraying. There was a growing awareness that maintaining a relationship required far more than affection. It demanded constant negotiation, vulnerability, and the courage to confront discomfort. For two highly accomplished individuals, the challenge was not scarcity of love, but scarcity of time and presence. Excellence in separate domains created an unintentional gap in shared life. Observing from a distance, one might be tempted to misread this as mere complication of fame. But the truth lies elsewhere. This story is about two people whose ambitions, achievements, and values intersected beautifully yet diverged with intensity. Amal's trajectory demanded rigor, discipline, and energy that were non-negotiable. Clooney's pursuits demanded immersion, reflection, and performance that were equally consuming. Neither was wrong. Both were fully themselves. And yet, being fully themselves at the same time created tension, subtle but relentless. Within this private narrative, there were moments of grace that punctuated the struggle. Small gestures, a shared meal, a bedtime story, a spontaneous video chat, reminded them of the love that had drawn them together. These instances were fragile, yet meaningful, illuminating what remained at stake. They revealed that the relationship was not defined by absence alone, but by the intentional acts that countered it. For Clooney, these moments reaffirmed the capacity to love despite distance. For Amal, they reinforced commitment while honoring independence. At the same time, these hidden episodes reveal the cost of silence. When frustration accumulates without articulation, when exhaustion replaces conversation, and when unspoken fears linger, even devoted love can feel tenuous. Friends and confidants observed this carefully. They noted that Clooney's humor, once effortless, now carried subtle tension. Amal's patience, once intuitive, now required deliberate calculation. Their interactions were exercises in maintaining balance, navigating the fine line between honesty and preservation. In recounting these episodes, insiders offered glimpses into emotions carefully guarded from public view. Clooney's confessions to close friends were tinged with melancholy. a recognition that he had underestimated the demands of sustaining love when lives move on parallel tracks. Amal's remarks to colleagues were equally telling, emphasizing responsibility, gratitude, and concern for the family, while subtly acknowledging the strain. The interplay of admiration, love, and fatigue created a dynamic both profound and precarious. These private stories also underscore the universality of human struggle. Fame and wealth do not insulate from emotional complexity. Ambition and achievement do not guarantee alignment. Even the most iconic relationships confront the same fundamental challenges: maintaining presence, sharing vulnerability, negotiating differences, and confronting change. In the Clooney's case, these challenges are amplified by public attention, global commitments, and the extraordinary accomplishments of each partner. Yet the underlying truths are recognizable. Love is active, fragile, and requires constant attention. The narrative of these quiet moments offers perspective on the resilience required in long-term relationships. It demonstrates that love is not only passion or chemistry. It is endurance, empathy, and shared effort. The couple's ability to navigate these challenges, to remain present in their children's lives, and to support each other professionally reflects a commitment that transcends the visible glamour. They are partners not only in life, but in navigating the complex intersection of personal ambition and shared responsibility. Finally, these lapsed, silent episodes highlight the tension between idealized expectation and lived reality. Public perception often assumes continuity, stability, and simplicity, especially when a couple is admired worldwide. Yet behind the curated images and headlines, life unfolds with complexity, compromise, and quiet negotiation. These stories, shared sparingly by insiders, reveal the depth of that reality, reminding observers that even celebrated love requires constant renewal, reflection, and the courage to engage with discomfort. The balance of devotion and distance, the interplay of admiration and strain, and the persistence of shared responsibility all converge to create a narrative rich in nuance and human complexity. In examining these quiet moments, it becomes clear that love is not static. It evolves, stretches, and is continuously tested. For George Clooney and Amal Clooney, the silent trials, the unspoken negotiations, and the deliberate efforts to maintain connection form a compelling portrait of modern partnership under extraordinary circumstances. Time has a way of revealing the contours of what is truly lasting. For George Clooney and Amal Clooney, the years following the early turbulence of distance and misalignment became a period of reflection, a quiet appraisal of what had been achieved, what had been preserved, and what was at risk. Their story, often framed by headlines as glamour and celebrity, was in reality a study of endurance, of legacy, and of the subtleties that underpin long-term commitment. Clooney's evolution over this period illustrates the intersection of personal ambition and relational responsibility. No longer the unencumbered bachelor whose life could pivot with whimsy, he had become a man acutely aware of limitations, of time, energy, and circumstance. He confronted the inevitability of aging, acknowledging both physical and emotional shifts. The Broadway rehearsals that once energized him now demanded a careful balance between exertion and self-care. Each performance, while a continuation of his artistic journey, became a reminder that life's pace could not be infinitely accelerated without consequence. Amal, by contrast, continued to advance along an extraordinary trajectory. Her professional commitments, teaching, litigation, and mentoring expanded with global recognition. She operated at a level of intensity few could match, and her ability to sustain focus and purpose became a pillar in their shared life. Yet this relentless momentum also highlighted a profound truth. Alignment in partnership does not require equality in daily activity, but it does demand mutual recognition and accommodation of differences. Their love, therefore, existed within a framework of respect for individual achievement and a deliberate negotiation of presence and attention. Within this framework, reflection became essential. Clooney often recounted moments of introspection, realizing that sustaining love required more than intention. It required continual awareness of subtle shifts in connection. He began to appreciate that the routines once taken for granted, the shared meals, casual conversations, spontaneous laughter, were in fact vital threads in the fabric of relational resilience. When these threads frayed under the pressure of ambition and distance, he understood that proactive maintenance, rather than reactive repair, was essential. Amal's perspective mirrored this insight. Her admiration for Clooney's devotion, his careful attention to their children, and his willingness to engage in deliberate acts of connection underscored a relational ethic that balanced independence with partnership. She recognized that sustaining a marriage between two highly accomplished individuals necessitated both emotional intelligence and strategic generosity. Each choice, whether to prioritize a professional commitment or a family obligation, was weighted with awareness of its cumulative effect on their shared life. Legacy emerged as another lens through which they examined their lives together. Beyond the public persona of celebrity and advocacy, there was the imprint of values, behaviors, and commitments passed to their children. Clooney reflected on the ways in which his children experienced both parental presence and the model dedication to craft and purpose. Amal considered how her example of professional rigor and ethical commitment shaped the environment in which her children learned responsibility and empathy. The dual focus on personal excellence and familial grounding became central to understanding the meaning of endurance. This period of reflection also revealed the subtle interplay of grief and gratitude. Clooney's acknowledgement of silence and emotional distance was accompanied by recognition of what remained: shared history, mutual respect, and the enduring presence of love, however tested. Grief existed not as dramatic sorrow, but as awareness of fragility. Gratitude manifested in the continued choice to engage, to communicate, and to preserve what had been intentionally built. These twin experiences, the sorrow of impermanence and the appreciation of effort, coexisted, shaping a mature perspective on relational longevity. Time also clarified the role of ambition as both a bridge and a barrier. The couple's shared recognition of purpose created moments of alignment, particularly when professional endeavors intersected with common values, such as human rights advocacy and cultural engagement. Simultaneously, the intensity of separate pursuits occasionally introduced friction, requiring negotiation and patience. The challenge was never to eliminate difference, but to cultivate an adaptive approach that honored both individual and shared objectives. This nuanced understanding reflected a profound sophistication in relational navigation, demanding both empathy and discipline. Importantly, reflection extended beyond personal or relational spheres into broader, philosophical contemplation. Clooney and Amal confronted the universal paradoxes of modern life: the tension between love and vocation, presence and ambition, individuality and interdependence. Their experience illuminated how even extraordinary privilege and visibility do not exempt one from the complexity of sustaining a partnership. Rather, visibility amplifies the stakes, as private struggles inevitably attract public interpretation, adding a layer of scrutiny that can intensify both pressure and insight. Within this reflective phase, moments of grace and insight emerged as signposts. Quiet dinners, shared experiences with their children, and collaborative philanthropic efforts became opportunities to reinforce connection, even when energy and time were constrained. The recognition of these moments as intentionally cultivated rather than accidental underscored the shift from reactive engagement to deliberate relationship stewardship. Love, they discovered, is sustained less by spontaneity than by awareness, choice, and intentionality. Finally, the reflective period emphasized that legacy is constructed through both action and presence. For Clooney, this meant balancing artistic ambition with active parental and spousal roles. For Amal, it involved harmonizing professional impact with familial engagement. Together, they navigated the interstices of private commitment and public expectation, demonstrating that enduring relationships require continuous negotiation, conscious attention, and the courage to confront both internal and external challenges. The lessons embedded in this reflective phase are subtle yet profound. Love and commitment are living processes requiring ongoing cultivation. Silence can conceal both stability and risk. Distance can test fidelity and connection simultaneously. Ambition can inspire partnership or impose separation. And through it all, conscious awareness, the deliberate attention to relational subtleties, emerges as the critical determinant of endurance and legacy. Even the most carefully curated lives cannot escape the passage of time, nor the inevitability of change. For George Clooney and Amal Clooney, the story that began with charm, admiration, and shared purpose now finds itself measured by endurance, subtlety, and reflection. Public perception continues to see the perfect couple, smiles at premieres, synchronized gestures on red carpets, and a family image that seems untouchable. But the truth behind the curated imagery is far more nuanced, layered with invisible negotiations, quiet sacrifices, and a weight of lived experience. In the final chapters of this ongoing narrative, the couple confronts the complex intersection of love, ambition, and the demands of visibility. Clooney's life, once defined by spontaneity and freedom, has been reshaped by responsibility, reflection, and the gravity of emotional honesty. He navigates the delicate terrain of being both an accomplished artist and a present parent, seeking to reconcile personal fulfillment with familial connection. Each decision is informed by the lessons of past missteps and successes, tempered by an awareness that actions carry long-term emotional weight. Amal continues to excel professionally, maintaining a presence in legal and academic spheres that commands respect worldwide. Her intellect, diligence, and commitment to justice persist as defining characteristics, shaping not only her career but also the environment in which her children grow. These commitments, however, coexist with the demands of marriage, parenting, and maintaining a partnership with someone whose life trajectory and pace often differ. The necessity of harmonizing these parallel lives illustrates the tension between personal purpose and relational cohesion, a tension navigated through empathy, communication, and deliberate effort. The subtleties of their interaction reveal the profound reality of mature partnership. Words are chosen carefully, gestures deliberate, and silences are laden with meaning. Laughter is measured, concern expressed with thoughtfulness, and presence is prioritized even when schedules and locations separate them physically. These dynamics illustrate the ongoing cultivation of connection in circumstances where misalignment could easily occur. Rather than relying solely on romance or shared history, the couple invests in strategies for sustained engagement, reinforcing bonds through intentional acts, however small. Children play a central role in anchoring this delicate balance. Ella and Alexander serve as both motivation and connective tissue, grounding the couple's attention in shared responsibility and providing moments of genuine joy. Parental roles demand presence, patience, and adaptability, requiring both Clooney and Amal to navigate the complexities of modern family life amidst global professional obligations. These responsibilities illuminate the interplay between private fulfillment and public identity, reinforcing the concept that love is expressed not merely through emotion, but through consistent, tangible action. Public scrutiny remains an unavoidable element. Every appearance, interview, or public engagement is observed, analyzed, and interpreted. The pressure to present continuity and harmony intensifies the challenge of navigating personal complexity. Maintaining privacy while fulfilling public expectations requires an extraordinary degree of self-awareness and strategic communication. The ability to project stability without concealing authenticity exemplifies a nuanced mastery of emotional labor and relational literacy. Through these trials, lessons emerge that extend beyond celebrity or notoriety. Love is sustained not by avoiding difficulty, but by embracing it. Silence, while often protective, must be balanced with honest engagement. Distance tests devotion, not necessarily loyalty. Ambition, rather than a source of conflict, can become a vehicle for mutual growth if navigated with intentionality. These insights transcend the particulars of the Clooney's life, offering reflections applicable to any partnership navigating complexity, change, or external pressure. The enduring image of their relationship lies not solely in perfection, but in resilience. Moments of misalignment, fatigue, or challenge are met with conscious effort, reflection, and a commitment to shared values. Connection is actively maintained through deliberate communication, empathy, and mutual acknowledgement of each other's individuality and needs. In doing so, the couple exemplifies a form of partnership that prioritizes sustainability over spectacle, substance over appearance. As the narrative closes, though not conclusively, for life remains dynamic, the couple's journey underscores the importance of perspective. Legacy is measured not only by accomplishments or public acclaim, but by the capacity to maintain meaningful bonds amidst complexity. Relationships are living entities, responsive to time, circumstance, and growth. The culmination of experience, reflection, and effort manifests as a quiet strength, a depth of understanding, and a resilient foundation for both family and shared purpose. Ultimately, the story of George Clooney and Amal Clooney is not defined by glamour or headlines. It is defined by the relentless work of staying connected, the courage to face emotional truths, and the wisdom to recognize that love requires both presence and patience. It is a testament to the enduring effort required to harmonize two extraordinary lives, to balance personal fulfillment with relational integrity, and to navigate a world in which every action, silence, and gesture carries significance. This final reflection leaves a lingering question for all observers. What does it truly mean to sustain love across time, ambition, and the pressures of public scrutiny? How does one honor both individual purpose and shared life? And what sacrifices must be consciously undertaken to preserve connection? For the Clooneys, the answers are ongoing, unfolding in real time, measured in quiet dinners, careful words, small gestures, and the cumulative weight of lived experience. Their story concludes not with finality, but with the profound recognition that enduring love is less about perfection and more about the relentless, conscious act of commitment. This is where their tale rests for now, leaving viewers with the weight of contemplation, the recognition of effort over ease, and the acknowledgement that even the most admired partnerships navigate struggle, silence, and renewal in their pursuit of lasting connection.